Hello, and welcome to the Full Circle Podcast, your source for insights into the science and art of endurance sports training and racing. I'm your host, Coach Laura Henry. It's time for Rad and Wretched Reads. A lot of people ask me how I find time to read as much as I do, or they make comments that they don't know how I have the time to read as much as I do. The answer is simultaneously both simple and hard. Reading is something that I value more than most other things. So as a result, ensuring that I have enough time to read is a high priority for me, and that's true when I'm casting out my schedule for a given day or even a week. Reading is a consistent daily habit that I've established for myself, and it is something that I will choose to do over any number of other things of value that I could be possibly choosing to do. When I was a kid, I read all the time, right up through high school. Things shifted when I went to college and through the first 10 or so years that I was an adult. I still read, but at a much slower rate, maybe about 5 to 10 books per year in those years. When the COVID-19 pandemic arrived in 2020, I found myself with vast expanses of time that I previously didn't have. I think a lot of people can relate to that. And during that time, I started to really examine how I had been spending my time prior to the pandemic. I realized that I had been spending it on things that weren't actually important to me, and that there were ways that I could be spending my time that would be much more valuable and add much more to my life, and by extension to the people who I care about who are around me. While the COVID-19 pandemic was so horrible and difficult in so many ways for so many people, and believe me, I know this firsthand as I watched someone I loved most in the world suffer and then ultimately die from the virus, it was actually a time of enlightenment for me. Precisely because I personally suffered so much during that time, I realized that I wanted, to the best of my ability anyway, to ensure that the days I had beyond the pandemic were filled with what actually mattered to me. Reading, thinking deeply, and living a deep life were a part of that. Spending time on social media, consuming mindless content on YouTube, watching shows that didn't actually interest me were just a few things that were not important to me. And those are some of the things that got eliminated in favor of things such as reading that I actually wanted to be doing. And so now I carve time every day to read. Some days this means I'm listening to an audiobook when I'm driving. I especially like to listen to memoirs and some nonfiction as audiobooks. I'm not as big of a fan of fiction audiobooks. Other days, it means I'm sitting in my reading chair with a physical book in my hands, and other days it means I'm reading my Kindle when I wake up or before I go to sleep. But somehow, some way, I'm reading every single day. With even just 10 to 20 minutes per day, it's amazing how many books you can read. So today, we're going to dive into our monthly recap of what I read in February of 2024. Some of the things I read were rad, and others were wretched. I'll discuss all of them and share links to all of the books that I read and that I reference in the show notes. We'll start off with the rad reads, and we'll begin with nonfiction. First up is 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. I thought that this was written and organized really well. I did read it as an audiobook or listen to it as an audiobook. It was really thought-provoking for me. So the title of the book, 4,000 Weeks, is a reference to the 76.7 years, which is the approximate average human lifespan. I like the title a lot because I think it illustrates really well just how short our lives actually are. When we think about it as 4,000 weeks, all of a sudden it doesn't sound so long. It sounds quite short. And I think that this should, and probably does for some people, but definitely should for a lot of folks, prompt people to consider how they are spending those 4,000 weeks. Are we spending them on things that actually matter to us? Are we just existing in the world? Are we wasting our time on things that don't matter to us? And should we reevaluate that so that we can spend our time on things that do? A lot of this book backed up what I've anecdotally observed to be true about how people view, utilize, and manage their time. And I do get a pretty front row seat to this in my work with athletes, especially the athletes I coach one-on-one in endurance coaching or endurance performance coaching. The book also gave me some new ideas to kind of muse over. The author says a lot of things that will be hard for a lot of people to hear. And I liked this because I share this habit of saying things to people that are hard for them to hear. And if we're being honest, I actually think that that habit is probably a main contributing factor to what has helped make me a successful coach for this many years. A good coach is a mirror. And a mirror, or a person who's acting as a mirror, will show you what you're really doing, even if you don't like what you see. And they can help you dive into how you can be better and or reach your goals. So they can help you kind of navigate how best to forge the path to get to where you want to go by examining where you are in a very truthful way. Another thing that I think this book prompted me to really think about is how I hear all the time from people the following statement: I don't have time. The more accurate version of this that people are truly saying without actually saying the exact words is often, I am unwilling to make that time, or I am unwilling to admit that I am making a choice to spend my time on one thing versus something else that I value. I've observed, and the book discusses this, that indecision makes people feel in the moment like they're having it all. So the lack of making a decision about how to spend your time makes you feel like you could spend it on everything. But the truth is that people are really just deluding themselves when they're doing this. They're diluting their energy, their attention, and then they're probably ultimately actually dropping the ball on several things, or at best being mediocre at those things. Decision is what is needed in order to have a chance at doing something well or being able to do something well. The author discusses how the things that we do are valuable precisely because we are not doing an infinite number of other things that might be of value to us when we are doing them. This prioritization is exactly what should make us cherish or covet what we're doing. And instead, what I see many people doing, and what the author also observes people doing, is wishing that they were doing something else. Fear that they're missing out on something else, attempts to multitask, which actually can't be done. That's a myth. And people tend to shirk away from this truth that when we choose to do something, we are actually choosing not to do everything else. I've talked about in the past, maybe ad nauseum, to some of the athletes I work with, how saying yes always means saying no to something. And the author really dives into this. The best and most effective way to manage our time is to embrace this and to be present for and savor what we're actually doing. Lamenting, fearing, or trying to pretend that we can do it all simultaneously is a wonderful recipe to either be mediocre or even poor at many things while being excellent at probably zero things. So what are the applications that I see for this book and what I learned in coaching? I already try to do this, and I think that this gave me some better language to help athletes become more self-aware about how they're using their time. And especially when we're trying to integrate training into life, this is a really important conversation. It's a conversation I have with a lot of athletes. How are you spending your time? How is training going to fit into your life? So this is a relevant point to be talking about. And then maybe to even help athletes make conscious choices about how they are spending their time. So whether they're choosing to do a workout, or sometimes, honestly, I encourage athletes to not do the workout, to do something else that is more valuable to them in that moment. I think that what I learned in this book is going to help me too with that. All in all, I think that this was a really thought-provoking and interesting read, and is a really nice catalyst for thought about how we are spending our time. All right, next up is Wintering, The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times by Katherine May. This was actually a reread, and I first read Wintering in the winter of 2021, and I noted then that it likely would be something that I would revisit in future years or winters to come. I find it to be a really valuable read, especially in the actual season of winter itself. The author discusses how we have seasonal winter, which we're all familiar with, and then how we all personally have winters in our own lives. And we're probably familiar with those, even if we haven't used that language to describe it. Rather than fighting winter, which so many people do, the author advocates for embracing it, both the season and then our own personal winters. Katherine May writes in the book, "We like to imagine that it's possible for life to be one eternal summer. We dream of an equatorial habitat forever close to the sun, an endless, unvarying high season. But life's not like that. It's been said before, and we've probably seen some social media memes or GIFs or something about this, how the changing of the colors of the leaves of deciduous trees in the fall can show us how beautiful letting things go can be. I want to expand upon that idea, that letting things go can be beautiful. And I'll again turn to what Katherine May writes in the book. Plants and animals don't fight the winter. They don't pretend it's not happening and attempt to carry on living the same lives that they lived in summer. They prepare. They adapt. They perform extraordinary acts of metamorphosis to get them through. Winter is not the death of the life cycle, but its crucible. Think about that. No other species on Earth, that we're aware of anyway, fights the changing of the seasons the way that humans do. And even though we may fight it mentally, we cannot stop the changing and the shifting of the seasons. Instead, we can aim to be like other living things that we share the planet with. We can prepare and we can embrace it. What are some of the applications in coaching? I've actually been using some of these lessons for the last several years since I first read the book, but this read was a nice reminder of them. I have had the honor of working with many athletes for many consecutive years at a time. As a result, I get to form authentic relationships with these people, and I walk with them as they navigate their lives, which inevitably include personal winters. This book gives me a lot of language and tools to discuss this and help athletes who are navigating those winters. And having experienced a lot of personal winters myself, I can leverage my firsthand perspective to help empathize and relate to the athletes that I'm working with. All right. So the next book we're going to talk about that I read is called Enchantment, Awakening Wonder in an Anxious Age. And this is also by Katherine May. So after I reread Wintering, I decided to read Katherine May's most recent release, which is Enchantment. I knew from reading Wintering that I like Katherine May's writing style and her method of storytelling. And so for these reasons, I was actually honestly really excited to read Enchantment. This book is not a how-to in terms of how to manage and deal with anxiety. So anyone looking for like a self-help book like that will not find it here. Rather, Enchantment offers a way of looking at the world that helps us to see some of the everyday magic that always exists around us. It's very well documented from lots of research over the years that experiencing awe is extremely therapeutic and good for mental health. And for these reasons, it can be a powerful tool to help manage anxiety and depression. Enchantment, the book, encourages the reader to experience awe and to allow themselves the possibility of being enchanted. It encourages this by showing that we do not need to go on a grand vacation to majestic mountains or to an island paradise to have an experience that is worthwhile. And all in all, I would say, much like Wintering, it is a beautiful book. It does a really nice job of sharing different stories and weaving a narrative that enticed me to see more enchantment in my own world. Applications in coaching for enchantment. So many of the athletes I work with are, whether they see it or not, on a perpetual hamster wheel. And by this, I mean that they're in a grind, kind of stuck in the mundane, only seeing the everydayness of their lives. And so many of the people I encounter beyond just the athletes I work with do not see wonder in the world. Honestly, so many people are closed-minded and negative, even if they cannot or will not identify as such. One of the most wonderful things about endurance sports is that our training and racing can take us on journeys that do enchant us and that inspire awe, if we're open to seeing that. This book encouraged me to double down on encouraging athletes to see all of the wonderful things that surround them when they are doing a workout or a race, or when they're just participating in training or making a choice to set forth towards a goal, and not to become trapped in the hamster wheel of things we must do and to kind of just get stuck there and all of a sudden wake up and a couple years later you're wondering where the time went and what you were doing. I don't want people to see only what they must do in the world. I want them to really experience it and find joy in it. And that's the crux of the work that I do with athletes, trying to help them find joy in sport and therefore, by extension, joy in their lives. Elvis and Me by Priscillia, Beaulieu, Presley is the next book I read this month. I really enjoy memoirs, and when the audiobook version of a memoir is read by the author, I try to listen to them as audiobooks because I think it makes the memoir itself feel more alive. And so some might wonder why I chose to read this book. And my choice to listen to this book definitely falls under the umbrella of I enjoy just a wide variety of books and topics and things. So I was really intrigued by this. My dad is a really big fan of Elvis Presley. So I grew up hearing Elvis, listening to Elvis, seeing Elvis because he had some Elvis memorabilia in the house. And so while I'm not as big of a fan as he is, there definitely is this familial connection to Elvis Presley. And I've grown up with an appreciation for him, his music, and the impact that he had on music and on worldwide culture in general. There have obviously been a lot of products written and produced about Elvis Presley. I wasn't necessarily interested in those. I was interested in this particular book because it was written by Priscilla, who, as his wife, likely knew him better than almost anyone else. And I felt that her narrative would be the closest of anyone who has produced a book about him to being accurate. And so that really intrigued me, and that made me want to read this. I don't know that I like Elvis more after reading this. In fact, I might like him a little less. And I have to admit, sometimes I was simultaneously fascinated by him and then horrified. And I think Priscilla actually talks about how she kind of went through this struggle herself when she married Elvis. She felt this tension between, wanting to become her own person and struggling with some of the things that came along with being part of Elvis's entourage. That being said, this book helped me understand how Elvis came to be who he was. He was coddled by his parents his entire life. He even slept in bed with them until he was an adult, according to Priscilla in this book. He was also legitimately blessed with exceptional talent and gifts. And once people learned that they could monetize that and use him, he became a target. He also achieved success at an extremely young age. So in many ways, I honestly don't know if Elvis Presley ever grew up. And that was a big takeaway for me from this book. People would then seek him out and try to get what they could out of him. And so in order to survive in some ways, he had to create a very small circle of people that he actually trusted. And he couldn't actually exist in the real world once he became famous, and that was in his early 20s. Priscilla discusses how everyone would cater to his moods and what he wanted, and that not many people would stand up to him. And so because of his power, his money, and his influence, standing up to him could mean that you became expendable. And I wondered as I was reading the book, if Elvis recognized during his life how tenuous and fragile the relationships around him were as a result of his behavior and the result that people felt so expendable, or that they felt their position was so tenuous. That being said, he did seem to genuinely care about providing for the people he cared about, and that plus his lavish lifestyle that he became accustomed to created a bit of a monster in him. His early adoption of drug use to include sleeping pills and other legitimate quote-unquote drugs destabilized him, and he was obviously well in more than a few ways. While this might not seem really conventional, I actually see there's a couple things that I can take away from this book and leverage in my work. It was a really good reminder to me that every person is the way they are for a reason. Everybody has a story. Everybody has a history. And what you see on the surface may not be the truth. And this book was a really nice reminder of that, because my entire job is interacting with people and trying to understand them so that I can help them reach their goals. The reminder that everyone has a reason, whether it's conscious or unconscious, why they are the way they are and why they behave the way they do, was a good one for me to be keeping in mind while I'm interacting with athletes. Okay, so next up is Strength and Conditioning for Cyclists, Off the Bike Conditioning for Performance and Life by Burt and Martin Evans. Out of all of the books that I read this month, this book is probably the most clearly related to coaching since it's about strength training and conditioning. I chose this book to read because I have followed Burt's work for many years. He's a physiotherapist in Great Britain. Here in the US, we call them physical therapists. And he worked with the Great Britain cycling team for 12 years, which covered 3 Olympic cycles. Burt is also a bike fitter, and I've read his work on bike fitting, which includes a book he wrote called Bike Fit 2nd Edition, Optimize Your Bike Position for High Performance and Injury Avoidance. I thought that both that book and this one were very well laid out and had really nice explanations for why Phil was making the recommendations that he was. It's actually hard for me to accurately judge this, but I think even someone who has less experience than I do would be able to understand this book about strength and conditioning and would be able to implement the principles that are shared in the book. I've read a lot and learned a lot about strength training over the years. One of the things I did do was go through the National Academy of Sports Medicine Certified Personal Trainer course, and I did pass their certification exam. And this is considered to be one of the tougher courses to become a certified personal trainer. I can vouch that it wasn't an easy course or an exam. It took me a full 6 months of study to feel like I had learned the material in a practical way, and that was applicable both in my work and in terms of being able to pass their exam. That being said, the passing of the exam wasn't the reason I did this. The reason I went through that course was for the actual educational content that the course was providing. I wanted to get very thoroughly educated on strength training. Strength training is so important for all endurance athletes, and anyone who has interacted with me or even listened to this podcast knows that that's something I have talked about in the past. It's also extremely easy to get injured when doing strength training. This is actually something that I recognized early on when I became a coach. And for the first few years that I was a coach, until I went through NASM's course, I actually refused to prescribe strength training workouts precisely because I knew I didn't know enough to be able to make good and safe recommendations for athletes. My experience has been that unfortunately many athletes think that strength training seems easy or should be simple enough that they can do it on their own, and I've observed that this is how injuries and lack of progress can occur. It is extremely common for athletes to want to get to quote-unquote real strength training, which consists of lifting heavy things up and putting them down and feeling the exertion that comes from that. And they don't appreciate that mobilization and stabilization need to be laid down as a framework first. What this means is that athletes need to ensure that their ranges of motion and movement patterns are solid before they can progress to loaded movements that include weights. This means that things like stretching, self-myofascial release, foam rolling would be an example of that, and bodyweight movements need to precede loaded movements with weights. And they need to for honestly a prolonged period of time, like months, not just a day or two. There has been a lot of research that has come out recently in the last 5 to 8 years that correctly states that lifting heavy is the stimulus that is needed for athletes to see strength gains. And that's especially been true for female athletes. That's a really true statement. It's also true that it is completely unsafe and irresponsible to do heavy lifting without the proper foundation or chassis in place to support it. And when I'm talking about foundation and chassis, I'm talking the actual structural integrity of a person, their physiology, the tendons, the ligaments, the bones, and the muscles of their body. This book does not go into detail about advanced levels of strength training or weightlifting. It's deliberately designed to explain the foundational principles of strength training and how everyday age group athletes can implement them successfully to see gains in their training. So again, because it's quote unquote basic, there are definitely some folks out there who might not find this valuable. That being said, almost every injury I see in endurance sports is because an athlete didn't respect the foundational basic elements and they imposed a load that exceeded their capacity. And capacity can exist in a lot of ways. It can be mechanical, it can be metabolic, it can be mental. But when load exceeds capacity is when injury happens. And in the strength training world or in the sports world, when we impose a load that our soft tissues and that our body is not physiologically ready for, that's when we get injured. Unless you are a full-time athlete or weightlifting is your full-time sport, you honestly are not going to be able to safely progress beyond what this book offers while you're concurrently doing aerobic or endurance training. So this book therefore becomes a really valuable addition for a lot of athletes. Most age group athletes honestly don't strength train enough to get to the point where they can go beyond what this book is offering. And that level of strength training that is beyond what the book offers would honestly too adversely impact their primary sport. So this book is a nice read for folks who are self-coached. So obviously there's a lot of applications for this book in my coaching. It gave me really good insight that is specifically relevant to cyclists and endurance athletes. I didn't necessarily learn a lot of new material from this book, but everything I read or watch or listen to always has at least a nugget that I can learn. And so this book taught me a few new things. There are a few assessments that are more specific to endurance athletes that will be good to incorporate into my coach's toolbox. And there's also a few progressions and pairings of exercises that I can definitely see would be valuable for some athletes that I hadn't previously considered. It also gave me a few new ways to explain and frame strength training principles, gave me different language to do that when I'm communicating with athletes. So all in all, I think that this was a really nice read. I was glad to have read it, and it made me continue to be a fan of Phil Burt and his work. Okay, moving on to fiction. I only read one fiction book this month. That's what I had time for. It was a bit of a long book. It was called My Dear Hamilton, and it's by Stephanie Dray and Laura Kamoie. So if you recognize those names, you'll know it from last month, because last month I read America's First Daughter, which is also written by these two authors, and I really enjoyed it. So then that prompted me to want to read My Dear Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton and his life story have obviously become much more well known in the last 10 or so years since Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote the Broadway musical Hamilton. Fun fact. The $10 bill is the only denomination of current U.S. currency where the featured person faces left, not right. And it's also the only denomination of current U.S. currency which features a person who is not a U.S. president. So behind the curtain, this is one of my favorite trivia things to say to people. Name the president on the $10 bill. And when they say Alexander Hamilton, you get to say, wasn't a president. So that being said, I've always been intrigued by Alexander Hamilton himself and the role he played in American history. As both this book and the play Hamilton accurately state, there honestly isn't a thing in U.S. government today that wasn't touched by Alexander Hamilton, and his legacy, as a result, continues straight through to today. It's also very interesting to me that he was murdered by the sitting vice president of the United States, who was Aaron Burr, and that Burr never faced any criminal charges for that crime. So from birth to death, Alexander Hamilton was an interesting guy. As I mentioned when I talked about America's First Daughter, these authors love to write stories that tell a story of history from the perspective of a female person of history. So I was curious to read an account of Alexander Hamilton imagined through the eyes of Eliza Schuyler Hamilton. This book is a novel, and it is Eliza's story, so it starts in her childhood and ends a few years before her death. She lived until 1854, which was 50 years beyond Alexander Hamilton. Like America's First Daughter, My Dear Hamilton is incredibly well researched, and it uses original source materials such as Alexander Hamilton's own correspondence when available to inform the choices that the authors made about how to tell this story. It is fiction, and they did take some liberties to fill in gaps that the source material didn't cover, and they also took some liberties with timelines to make the book flow better and to make the story better. That being said, I thought that it was incredibly engaging, well written, and that it provoked a lot of interest in the time around America's founding and in the events that ultimately led led to and immediately following the creation of the United States. And I really like it when a work of fiction can inspire interest in history. So I really enjoyed this book for so many reasons. All right, so those were all of the rad reads, and now we'll move on to wretched reads. Thankfully, there was only one this month. And honestly, I don't even know that I usually can finish a wretched read, but this one I did. Typically, if I think something's terrible, I will abandon it now. I used to not do that. If I started a book, I was in it for the long haul. I was finishing that thing. And what I found is that just detracted from my joy of reading. I would be unmotivated to read. Some people talk about how they're motivated to read it faster so they get through it, and that's not my experience. I want to make sure I'm encouraging and fostering this love I do have of reading, so that includes not reading things that are terrible. That being said, I did listen to the audiobook version of Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World by David Epstein, and if I had one word to summarize this book, it would be overrated. I was actually really excited to read it because it was recommended to me many times over the last several years by sources that I trust and who generally recommend interesting and good books. This was not an interesting or a good book. It was a slog, and I was happy when it was done. I absolutely do not think that it was as wonderful or profound as everyone who recommended it professed to be, or even as the reviews indicate on the New York Times or on Amazon or on Goodreads. Honestly, other than the opening narrative about Tiger Woods and Roger Federer and about how they became the greatest of all times in their sports through very different pathways, I cannot actually remember anything else I read or heard in this book. This book tries to establish and explain why following the generalist paths is better than specializing, especially why it's better than specializing too early. And while I have anecdotally observed the value of this exact approach again and again in my life, this book did not offer any real answers to some questions that I've had about why this might be so. I personally do have a general background, and I think it's exactly what has led me to success in many areas of my life. I've worked many entry-level jobs that don't require a lot of specialization throughout my entire life. I majored in communications in college. I've worked in security and law enforcement. And then ultimately, I've now found my calling in endurance sports. I didn't even do sports or identify as an athlete until I was 25 years old. And yeah, I've landed here. So I definitely see how having a general approach to things can lead to success and happiness over time. That being said, this book didn't have any stories of progressive radical change makers who effected great change by linking together many disciplines. And I know that there are so many of them out there, to include Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Founding Fathers, or even today, Elon Musk. Overall, Range was forgettable, repetitive, boring, and uninsightful. Save yourself, folks. Don't read it. I hope that you have enjoyed my rad and wretched reads for February 2024. If you'd like to learn more about the books I discussed, there's a full list of them all in the show notes. In the coming month, I hope that you are able to discover at least one book that sparks insight and joy for you. Happy reading. That was another episode of the Full Circle Podcast. Subscribe to the Full Circle Podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. If you like what you listen to, please be sure to leave us a rating and review, as this goes a long way in helping us reach others. The thoughts and opinions expressed on the Full Circle Podcast are those of the individual. As always, we love to hear from you, and we value your feedback. Please send us an email at podcast@fullcircleendurance.com or visit us at fullcircleendurance.com/podcast. To find training plans, see what other coaching services we offer, or to join our community, please visit fullcircleendurance.com. I'm Coach Laura Henry. Thanks for listening.